The first time most people noticed Mei Lin was when she didn't get noticed at all. She slipped into the community college music room 5 minutes before the beginner piano class began, chose a seat in the back corner, and kept her eyes down while unpacking her simple notebook. A few students glanced her way, but their attention quickly returned to their conversations. Mei appeared to be in her early 30s, with straight black hair cut at her shoulders, wearing a plain gray sweater that seemed chosen specifically to blend into the background. Professor Reynolds was known for his theatrical entrances, and today was no exception. He burst through the door with arms spread wide, his voice filling the room before he was fully inside. Welcome, future pianists. Today we begin the journey of 1,000 miles with our first humble steps. His eyes swept across the 23 students, pausing briefly on Mei before continuing. Let's start with introductions. Tell us your name and why you've chosen to torture your fingers with piano lessons. The students laughed nervously. One by one they shared their stories. A retired accountant fulfilling a lifelong dream, a young mother wanting to play lullabies for her baby, a teenager hoping to impress a crush. When it was Mei's turn, she spoke so softly that Professor Reynolds had to ask her to repeat herself. "I'm Mei," she said, her voice barely louder the second time. "I've always liked music. I just want to learn." If Professor Reynolds found her answer unsatisfying, he didn't show it. He simply nodded and moved on to the next student. Mei's shoulders relaxed slightly as attention shifted away from her. The first class was simple, learning the names of the keys, proper hand positioning, and the importance of posture. When Professor Reynolds demonstrated the C major scale, Mei watched with unusual intensity, her eyes following his fingers as if memorizing every movement. Yet when he asked for volunteers to try, she kept her hand down and her gaze fixed on her notebook. "You there in the gray, Mei, right? Why don't you give it a try?" Professor Reynolds gestured toward the upright piano at the front of the room. A flicker of something crossed Mei's face, panic perhaps, or reluctance, before she nodded and walked slowly to the piano. She sat at the bench and positioned her hands over the keys, then hesitated, looking at Professor Reynolds as if for permission. "Go ahead," he encouraged. "Just the C scale. Start with your thumb on middle C." Mei pressed the first key with obvious care, producing a clean, clear tone. She continued through the scale, each note deliberately spaced, her tempo cautious and uneven. When she finished, she quickly returned to her seat without meeting anyone's eyes. "Not bad," Professor Reynolds said. "A bit hesitant, but that's to be expected on your first day. You'll get more comfortable with practice." What no one noticed was how Mei's fingers had twitched slightly before pressing each key, as if stopping themselves from moving too quickly or too confidently. Over the next few weeks, Mei established herself as the quietest student in class. She arrived early, left promptly when class ended, and spoke only when directly addressed. Her playing remained hesitant, sometimes fumbling over simple exercises that other beginners mastered quickly. Professor Reynolds often had to remind her to relax her shoulders or correct her fingering. "You're thinking too much," he told her once, after she struggled through a basic fingering exercise. "Let your hands do what comes naturally." A strange smile flickered across Mei's face before disappearing. "I'll try," she murmured. What Professor Reynolds and the other students didn't see was Mei after class, sitting in her small apartment at an electronic keyboard with headphones plugged in. They didn't see how her posture changed when she was alone, her back straightening, her shoulders dropping into perfect relaxation. They didn't see how her fingers, which stumbled in class, now moved across the keys with fluid grace, playing pieces far beyond the simple exercises assigned to the beginner class. They also didn't know about the box under her bed containing yellowed newspaper clippings in Chinese, showing a solemn-faced child seated at concert grand pianos. They hadn't heard the recordings locked away on an old hard drive, or seen the trophies wrapped in cloth and hidden in her closet. The Mei Lin they knew was a beginner struggling with basic scales, not the girl once called the Pearl of Shanghai by critics who had run out of superlatives to describe her playing. As weeks turned into months, Mei became part of the classroom furniture, present but unremarkable. Other students who had started at the same level were now progressing to simple songs, while Mei continued to play with deliberate awkwardness. Professor Reynolds grew increasingly puzzled by her lack of progress, despite her obvious attention during lessons. One rainy Tuesday, he asked her to stay after class. "Mei, I notice you watch everything very carefully. But your playing isn't improving much, he said gently. Are you practicing at home? Yes, she said, clutching her notebook. Every day. Perhaps you need a different approach. Would you like some extra help? I have teaching assistants who could work with you one-on-one. No, thank you, May said quickly, too quickly. I'm happy with the class. I just need more time. Professor Reynolds studied her face, trying to understand the disconnect between her enthusiasm for being in class and her apparent inability to progress. May I ask why you wanted to learn piano? Sometimes understanding the motivation helps with the learning process. May was quiet for so long that Professor Reynolds thought she might not answer. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but steady. I used to know someone who played beautifully. Being around pianos again, it feels like being close to them. The answer seemed to satisfy Professor Reynolds, who nodded sympathetically. Music connects us to memories in powerful ways. Well, take your time. There's no rush. As May left the building, the rain had stopped. She walked past the music department's Pride and Joy, a small recital hall with a Steinway grand piano visible through the glass doors. She paused, glancing around to ensure no one was watching, then slipped inside. The room was empty, the piano lid closed. May approached it slowly, running her fingers lightly across its polished surface. She looked at her reflection in the black lacquer, a plain woman with nothing remarkable about her. Exactly as she wanted to appear. She sat on the bench and lifted the lid, revealing the keys beneath. For a long moment, she simply stared at them, not touching. Then, with a small sigh that seemed to release something long held inside, she placed her hands in position. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the empty hall. May's fingers danced across the keys with the confidence of thousands of hours of practice, her body swaying slightly with the music. The hesitation that marked her playing in class was completely gone, replaced by absolute technical control and emotional expressiveness that transformed the simple college recital room into a concert hall. She played with her eyes closed, lost in the music, unaware of anything else, including the janitor who had stopped in the doorway, mop in hand, listening with widening eyes to the kind of performance he had only ever heard on recordings. When the final notes faded, May sat motionless for several seconds. Then, as if waking from a dream, her shoulders hunched forward again. Her expression returned to its usual blankness, and she carefully closed the piano lid. She turned to leave and froze when she saw the janitor. They stared at each other in silence. That was... He began, but couldn't find words to continue. Please don't tell anyone, May said, her voice barely audible. I'm not ready for people to know. The janitor, a gray-haired man named Chen who had worked at the college for 20 years, studied her face. Something in her eyes, a mixture of plea and pain, made him nod. Your secret is safe with me, he promised. But why hide such a gift? May looked back at the piano. Sometimes gifts become cages, she said simply. Then she hurried past him and out into the evening. Just another unremarkable woman hurrying home after class, carrying a secret as complex and beautiful as the music still echoing in the empty hall. What no one at the community college could have guessed was that in just a few weeks, during a master class with a visiting professor, Melian's carefully constructed ordinary life would spectacularly unravel. But for now, she remained invisible, exactly as she wanted to be. Word spread quickly through the music department that a special guest would be visiting their humble community college. Professor Reynolds couldn't contain his excitement as he announced it to the beginner piano class. This Friday, we're being honored with a master class from Dr. Anton Voronin, he said, his voice rising with each word. He's a professor at the conservatory and has performed with symphonies around the world. The students murmured with interest. A real concert pianist coming to their class seemed both exciting and intimidating. Will we have to play for him? Asked one nervous student. Not individually, Professor Reynolds assured them, but we'll demonstrate as a group what we've been learning. So practice those scales and arpeggios. Throughout the announcement, May sat quietly in her usual back corner seat. Only the slight tightening of her fingers around her pencil betrayed any reaction. As students filed out after class, she approached Professor Reynolds. Will attendance be required for the master class? She asked softly. Professor Reynolds looked surprised. Of course. This is an incredible opportunity, May. Dr. Voronin rarely teaches at the community college level. May nodded and turned to leave, but the professor called after her. I know you're still struggling with the basics, but don't worry. No one will be singled out. Something flashed in May's eyes. Not fear, as Professor Reynolds assumed, but something deeper. She simply nodded again and left the room. That night, Chen the janitor noticed a light in the recital hall long after the building should have been empty. He found May sitting at the piano, staring at the keys without playing. "You've been coming here late for weeks," he said gently. "But tonight you're not playing." May looked up, startled. Then her shoulders relaxed when she recognized him. "I might need to leave the class," she said after a long silence. "Because of the visiting teacher?" Chen asked. He'd heard the excitement buzzing through the department all day. May nodded. "Dr. Voronin, I know his work. He has excellent ears. And that's a problem because you don't want anyone to hear how well you really play," Chen said, understanding dawning. "But why? You play beautifully. Why hide it?" May's hands hovered over the keys, not touching them. "Have you ever had something you loved turn into something you feared?" she asked. Before Chen could answer, she stood up. "I should go. Thank you for keeping my secret." The days passed quickly and soon Friday arrived. The practice room had been rearranged with chairs in a semicircle around the grand piano. Students filed in nervously, dressed in their best clothes. May arrived last, wearing the same gray sweater she always wore, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Dr. Anton Voronin entered the room with Professor Reynolds, and a hush fell over the students. Voronin was tall and thin, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. He wore a black suit that had seen better days, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who belonged on the world's greatest stages. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying a slight Russian accent. "I am pleased to meet the next generation of pianists." For the next hour, Dr. Voronin discussed the fundamentals of piano technique, occasionally demonstrating on the grand piano with a skill that left the students in awe. His fingers moved across the keys with effortless precision, drawing sounds from the instrument that made it seem alive. "Now," he said, clapping his hands together, "Professor Reynolds tells me you have been working on a simplified version of Chopin's Revolutionary Etude. I would like to hear it." The students looked at each other nervously. They had indeed been working on a greatly simplified arrangement of the famous piece, reduced to its basic melody with straightforward left-hand chords. Professor Reynolds guided 5 volunteers to the electronic keyboard set up around the room. "We'll play the first page together," he said encouragingly. What followed was a well-meaning but painfully hesitant rendition of Chopin's masterpiece. The students played carefully, their faces tense with concentration, while Professor Reynolds nodded encouragement. When they finished, Dr. Voronin's expression remained neutral. "Thank you," he said. Then he turned to the grand piano and sat down. Without a word, he launched into the actual Revolutionary Etude at full speed and difficulty. His left hand thundered through the challenging runs while his right hand articulated the melody with crystal clarity. The difference between the student's simplified version and the real piece was like comparing a child's crayon drawing to a Renaissance painting. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Dr. Voronin stood and bowed slightly. "That," he said, "is what you are working toward. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. This is why we practice. This is why we endure the frustration of slow progress." He scanned the room, his eyes stopping on May in the back row. "You," he said, pointing directly at her. "You have not played for us yet." May's face drained of color. "I'm not very good," she said quietly. "That is not the point," Dr. Voronin replied. "The point is to try, to face the difficulty. Come." Professor Reynolds stepped forward. "Dr. Voronin, May is one of our beginners who's having some challenges with the basics." "Perhaps another student—" "No," Dr. Voronin interrupted. "Precisely because she struggles, she should try. This is how we learn to overcome." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to May, who sat frozen in her chair. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse. Then slowly she stood and walked to the piano. As she sat on the bench, Dr. Voronin placed sheet music in front of her, the full, original version of the Revolutionary Etude. "This is impossible," Professor Reynolds protested. "That piece takes years of training." "I am not expecting perfection," Dr. Voronin said. "I want to demonstrate something about approaching difficulty." He turned to May. "Play just the first line as best you can. The point is not to succeed, but to attempt." May stared at the sheet music, though her eyes seemed to look through it rather than at it. The room was thick with tension. Several students squirmed uncomfortably, feeling second-hand embarrassment for what was about to happen. At the back of the room, Chen the janitor had paused while emptying a trash can, watching the scene unfold with concern in his eyes. May placed her hands on the keys. She took a deep breath. Then another Dr. Voronin waited, his arms crossed. "Whenever you're ready," he said, his tone gentler now. May closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something had changed in her posture. Her back straightened almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders relaxed. Her fingers curved naturally over the keys in perfect playing position. The first notes of the etude filled the room, not hesitant or simplified, but played with the technical precision and emotional power of a concert pianist. Her left hand flew through the challenging runs with flawless accuracy, while her right hand brought out the revolutionary fervor that had inspired Chopin's composition. Professor Reynolds' mouth fell open. The student stared in disbelief. Dr. Voronin's eyebrows shot up, and he took an involuntary step back from the piano. May played not just the first line as requested, but continued through the entire first page of the piece. Her body swayed slightly with the music, her face transformed by complete immersion in the sound she was creating. This was not the same woman who had struggled to play simple scales for months. This was an artist in complete command of her instrument. When she reached the end of the first page, her hands lifted from the keys and hovered there for a moment before returning to her lap. The room remained in stunned silence. Dr. Voronin was the first to speak. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. May kept her eyes on the piano keys. "Just a student," she answered. "No," Dr. Voronin said firmly. "You are not just anything. That was not the playing of a beginner, or even an advanced student. That was the playing of a master." Professor Reynolds had recovered enough to step forward. "May, I don't understand. You've been in my beginner class for months, struggling with basic exercises." A flush crept up May's neck. The room seemed to be closing in around her as all eyes remained fixed on her face. The carefully constructed walls of her private life were crumbling, and panic flashed in her eyes as she looked around for an escape. At the back of the room, Chen caught her eye and gave her an encouraging nod. May took a deep breath. "I'm sorry for the deception," she said softly. "I never intended for this to happen." "But why?" Professor Reynolds asked. "Why pretend to be a beginner when you can play like that?" May's fingers traced the edge of the piano keys, not pressing them. "Sometimes," she said, her voice gaining strength, "you need to step away from who you were to find out who you might become." Dr. Voronin's stern expression had softened into something like wonder. "Who were you then?" he asked. May looked up, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "That," she said with quiet dignity, "is what I came here hoping not to be asked. At least not yet." The room hummed with unspoken questions. The mystery of Maylene had only deepened, and as the master class continued around her, students couldn't help stealing glances at the unremarkable woman who had suddenly become the most remarkable person in the room. The room emptied slowly after the master class, students lingering to stare at May with newfound curiosity. She sat alone at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys without pressing them. The revelation had left her feeling oddly hollow, as if something precious had been taken from her. Professor Reynolds and Dr. Voronin stood near the door, speaking in low voices while occasionally glancing in her direction. May could feel their eyes on her back but couldn't bring herself to turn around. The peaceful anonymity she had carefully built over months had shattered in minutes. Finally, the two men approached. Professor Reynolds looked bewildered while Dr. Voronin's expression was one of intense interest. "May," Professor Reynolds began, "I think we need to talk." She nodded, resigned. "I know. Why don't we go to my office?" he suggested gently. "More private there." May followed them down the hallway, aware of whispers trailing behind her. News traveled fast in the small music department, and by Monday, everyone would know about the beginner student who played like a professional. Professor Reynolds' office was small but warm, with framed concert programs on the walls and stacks of sheet music covering every surface. He cleared some papers from a chair for May while Dr. Voronin leaned against the desk. "I owe you an apology," May said before either man could speak. "I wasn't honest about my abilities." "That's putting it mildly," Professor Reynolds said, though his tone held more confusion than anger. "You've been in my class for nearly 4 months. deliberately playing poorly. I'd like to understand why. May's hands twisted in her lap. I didn't join the class to deceive anyone. I just wanted to be around music again, to be in a place where pianos were available but without any pressure. But your skill level, Dr. Veronin interjected, that was not merely advanced playing. That was world-class technique. Where did you study? May hesitated, her eyes dropping to her hands. For a moment it seemed she might not answer. Then she sighed. I was trained from age 3 at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music, she said quietly. I never attended regular school. The piano was my entire life. Professor Reynolds' eyebrows shot up. The Shanghai Conservatory? That's one of the most prestigious music schools in Asia. Yes, May acknowledged. By 6, I was performing Beethoven sonatas. By 10, I was touring with orchestras across China and Japan. Wait, Dr. Veronin said, leaning forward suddenly. Were you May Lin? The child prodigy from the early 2000s? May winced slightly at hearing the name spoken aloud as if it caused her physical pain. She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. Dr. Veronin turned to Professor Reynolds with wide eyes. I saw her perform Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto in Vienna when she was 14. The audience gave her a 10-minute standing ovation. Critics called her the most promising pianist of her generation. He turned back to May. Then you disappeared. There were rumors. Yes, May interrupted. There were many rumors. Some of them were even true. Her voice had taken on a brittle quality. Professor Reynolds looked between them, still trying to catch up. I don't understand. If you had such a promising career, why would you pretend to be a beginner in a community college piano class? May was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was so soft they had to lean forward to hear her. Because I needed to remember what it felt like before the pressure, before the expectations, before music became something that was done to me rather than something I did because I loved it. The office fell silent. Through the window, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room. What happened? Professor Reynolds asked gently. May looked up, her eyes meeting his directly for perhaps the first time since she'd joined his class. I collapsed during a performance of Liszt's Transcendental Etudes in Beijing, right on stage in front of 2,000 people. My hands... She held them up, looking at them as if they belonged to someone else. They just stopped working. The doctors called it focal dystonia, a neurological condition common in musicians who practice too intensively. Dr. Voronin nodded with understanding. Career-ending in many cases. In my case, it wasn't just physical, May continued. After the collapse, I couldn't even look at a piano without feeling sick. Every note reminded me of failure, of disappointing everyone. My teachers, my parents, the audiences who expected perfection. So you walked away, Professor Reynolds said. It wasn't a question. I moved to America. Started over. Got a job translating technical documents. Lived a quiet life. A small, sad smile crossed her face. For years, I avoided music entirely. Then, 6 months ago, I was walking past the college and heard someone playing in one of the practice rooms. It wasn't particularly good, no offense, Professor. Professor Reynolds chuckled. None taken, but something about it drew me in. The player was making mistakes but kept going, just enjoying the process. She shrugged. I found myself enrolling in classes the next day. But why pretend to be a beginner? Professor Reynolds asked. I wasn't ready to be May Lin the prodigy again. That person, she doesn't exist anymore. May looked down at her hands. The dystonia eventually faded with therapy and time away from performing, but the fear remained. I thought if I could just be around music again as someone ordinary, maybe I could find my way back to loving it. Dr. Veronin, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. And have you? Found your way back? A genuine smile brightened May's face for the first time. Yes. Watching everyone learn, seeing their small triumphs, hearing music played for joy rather than perfection. It's been healing. I've been playing again at home and sometimes here when the building is empty. She glanced apologetically at Professor Reynolds. Your janitor Chen caught me once. He's been keeping my secret. Professor Reynolds shook his head in amazement. All this time I thought you were my worst student and you turn out to be better than I could ever hope to be. May looked distressed. I never meant to deceive you. Not really. I just wasn't ready to be seen. And now, Dr. Veronin asked, now that we've seen what you can do, what will you do next? The question hung in the air. May's hands twisted in her lap again as she considered. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to run away again, start over somewhere else, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. Maybe there's a middle ground. Not the child prodigy performing impossible programs to please others, but not the false beginner either. Just May who loves music and happens to play well. Professor Reynolds leaned forward, his face alight with an idea. The department has a small recital next month. Nothing fancy, just students playing for friends and family. Would you consider participating? Not as a returning virtuoso, just as one of our students sharing what they love. May looked uncertain. I don't know if I'm ready for an audience again. Think about it, he said gently. No pressure. Either way, I hope you'll stay in the program, though perhaps not in the beginner class. A small laugh escaped her. That seems fair. As they left the office, the hallway was mostly empty. A few students practicing in rooms looked up as they passed, their eyes widening at the sight of May walking alongside Dr. Voronin. Word was already spreading. At the building exit, Dr. Voronin stopped and turned to May. I have seen many talented pianists in my career, he said. Some play with perfect technique but no heart. Others have great feeling but limited skills. Rarely do I encounter someone with both in abundance. He looked at her with sincere respect. Whatever you decide to do with your gift, whether you share it widely or keep it private, I know that it remains extraordinary. Thanked him quietly and watched as he and Professor Reynolds walked toward the faculty parking lot, still deep in conversation about her. The campus was peaceful in the early evening light. May stood for a moment, feeling strangely lighter despite the exposure of her secret. For the first time in years, she had spoken about her past aloud, and the world hadn't ended. She began walking toward the bus stop, but then paused and looked back at the music building. After a moment's hesitation, she turned and walked back inside, her steps growing more confident as she approached the practice room wing. Students looked up as she passed, whispering behind their hands. May kept walking, head high, until she reached the grand piano in the recital hall. It sat in the fading light, its lid closed, waiting. She sat on the bench and gently lifted the lid. For a long moment, she simply looked at the keys, pristine white and black in perfect order. Then she began to play. Not the thundering Chopin that had exposed her secret, but a gentle Debussy prelude that floated through the empty hall like a dream. She played not as May Lin the prodigy, nor as the false beginner, but simply as herself. A woman rediscovering what it meant to make music for the pure joy of it. And as the final notes hung in the air, a small smile touched her lips. The revelation hadn't been an ending after all. Perhaps it was a beginning. By Monday morning, everyone at the community college knew about May Lin. Students who had never noticed her before now watched her walk down the hallway, whispering behind their hands. The story had grown with each telling. She wasn't just good. She was a forgotten legend, a mysterious genius, a fallen star trying to hide in plain sight. May arrived at the music building earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the stairs, but a small group of students was already waiting outside Professor Reynolds' office. They fell silent when they saw her, their eyes following her movement down the hallway. Is it true? One of them finally called after her. Were you famous? May kept walking, her shoulders hunched slightly, her eyes fixed on the floor ahead. Fame had always been the part she hated most, the way it made people look at you differently, like you were something other than human. She found Chen buffing the floor in the recital hall. He smiled when he saw her. You're still here, he said. I wasn't sure you would be. I almost wasn't, May admitted, setting her bag down on a chair. I packed everything last night. Had the bus schedule pulled up on my phone? What stopped you? May looked at the grand piano in the center of the room. I realized I'd be running away again, and I'm tired of running. Chen nodded, leaning on his buffer. So what now? Before she could answer, Professor Reynolds appeared in the doorway. May. I was hoping to catch you before class. Do you have a moment? Chen gave her an encouraging nod and returned to his work as May followed the professor to his office. Inside, he handed her a folder. I've been doing some research, he said, his voice vibrating with barely contained excitement. After Dr. Voronin mentioned your name, I looked you up. The things people wrote about your playing. He shook his head in wonder. May left the folder closed on her lap. That was a different person, perhaps, Professor Reynolds acknowledged. But your talent remains extraordinary, which is why I wanted to talk to you about some options. He outlined several possibilities. a transfer to the Advanced Performance Program, private lessons with Dr. Veronin, who had expressed special interest in working with her, even scholarship opportunities at prestigious music schools that would overlook her unusual situation. "I appreciate the thought," May said when he finished, "but I don't think I'm ready for any of that." Professor Reynolds leaned back, studying her face. "What are you ready for, then?" It was a simple question, but May found herself without an easy answer. After a moment, she said, "I think I'd like to stay in the program, but maybe join the intermediate class instead of beginner." "And about the recital you mentioned?" She paused, took a deep breath. "I might be willing to play something. Something small." Professor Reynolds beamed. "That would be wonderful. The students would be thrilled to hear you play. Actually, many of them have been asking if you might offer some tips. You have a unique perspective, having trained at such a high level." May stiffened. "I'm not a teacher. Not formally, no. But sometimes the best insights come from those who've struggled with their gift, not just those for whom it came easily." He saw her discomfort and backed off. Just something to consider. No pressure. As May left his office, she nearly collided with a young man waiting in the hallway, one of the students from her beginner class. He stepped back awkwardly. "Sorry," he mumbled. I wanted to say your playing was amazing on Friday." May thanked him quietly and tried to move past. "I've been stuck on this one passage for weeks," he continued quickly, as if afraid she'd leave before he could finish. "I was wondering if maybe you could show me how you'd approach it. Just for a minute." Something in his earnest expression reminded May of herself at a much younger age. The hunger to improve, to understand. Before she could overthink it, she found herself saying, "Show me." He led her to a practice room with an upright piano and opened his music to a simple Bach invention. "That's this part here," he said, pointing to a measure. "My fingers always get tangled." May sat down and played through the passage slowly, then again with a slightly different fingering. "Try thinking of your hand as a unit moving together rather than 5 separate fingers," she suggested. The young man tried it, his face lighting up when he made it through the passage smoothly for the first time. "That's it. That's exactly what I needed." A warm feeling spread through May's chest, different from the rush of performing but somehow more satisfying. She found herself offering another suggestion, then another until 20 minutes had passed. "Thank you so much," the student said as they finished. "You explained it better than anyone has before." More students approached May throughout the week, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as word spread that she was willing to help. She found herself holding informal sessions after classes, showing techniques she had learned years ago, adapting her knowledge for players of different levels. The stares and whispers gradually changed in nature. She was still a curiosity, but increasingly she was becoming known for her patience and insight as much as for her mysterious past. The department recital approached quickly. May had chosen a piece that wouldn't draw too much attention, a lovely but not overly flashy Schubert impromptu. She practiced daily, not with the punishing intensity of her childhood, but with a growing sense of pleasure. The night before the recital, she stayed late at the college working through the piece one final time. Chen found her there as he often did. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, settling into a chair to listen. May's hands stilled on the keys. "A little," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I played for people who were actually listening." "You've been playing for your students," Chen pointed out. "That's different. They're focused on learning, not judging." Chen considered this. "You know, when you first started sneaking in here to play, I used to stop and listen outside the door. Not because you were some prodigy, but because the music made me feel something." He smiled at her surprised expression. "That's what music is supposed to do, isn't it? Make people feel?" "My teachers always emphasized technique and precision," May said. Feeling was secondary, and now, May thought about the students she'd been helping, how their faces lit up when they conquered a difficult passage, how they spoke about what they hoped their music would convey. Now I think it might be the other way around. The recital hall was packed the next evening. Family members and friends filled the seats, programs rustling as they waited for the performances to begin. Backstage, students paced nervously or sat frozen in concentration. May wore a simple black dress, nothing fancy, but a step up from her usual gray sweater. She had considered backing out a dozen times throughout the day, but each time she remembered Chen's words about making people feel, Professor Reynolds had placed her in the middle of the program, not wanting to end with her and overshadow the other students. When her name was called, the audience stirred with interest. Many had heard rumors about the former prodigy. May walked to the piano with measured steps, trying to control the trembling in her hands. As she sat and adjusted the bench, memories flooded back. The crushing pressure of competitions, the critical eyes of judges, the weight of enormous expectations. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, she saw her beginner class students in the front row, watching her with encouraging smiles. Behind them sat Chen, giving her a subtle thumbs up. The Schubert began tentatively, not from lack of skill but from her conscious choice to ease into the music rather than attack it. She let the gentle melody unfold naturally, building in warmth and confidence as it progressed. This wasn't the technically flawless performance of her competition days, but something more personal and honest. As she played, May realized something had fundamentally shifted inside her. The notes on the page were no longer commands to be perfectly executed, but suggestions to be interpreted. The audience wasn't a jury to impress, but people to connect with. The piano wasn't an instrument of torture, but a voice for emotions she'd suppressed for too long. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of silence before the applause began, warm and genuine. May stood and bowed slightly, her eyes finding Chen in the audience. He was smiling broadly, clapping louder than anyone. Backstage after the recital, students and faculty surrounded May with congratulations. Professor Reynolds beamed like a proud father. "That was beautiful, May," he said. "Different from the Chopin you played for Dr. Voronin. More intimate somehow." "It felt different," she acknowledged. "Better." As the crowd thinned, the young man from her beginner class approached with his parents. "This is the teacher I told you about," he said excitedly. "The one who helped me with Bach." His mother took May's hand warmly. "Thank you for helping him. He's practiced more these past 2 weeks than in the 6 months before." "I'm not really a teacher," May began automatically. The student's father smiled. "From what our son tells us, you very much are." As they walked away, May found herself considering those words. The path ahead was still uncertain. She wasn't ready for concert halls again, might never be. But perhaps there was another way to share her gift, one that wouldn't consume her as before. Later that evening, as the janitors cleaned up after the recital, Chen found May still sitting at the piano, her fingers tracing the keys without pressing them. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. May looked up, a tentative smile on her face. "The future. For the first time in years, I'm thinking about the future." 6 months passed, bringing changes that May could never have imagined when she first slipped into the back row of the beginner piano class. Spring arrived on campus with cherry blossoms scattering pink petals across the walkways and sunlight streaming through the windows of the music building. Professor Reynolds found me in her usual spot, not hiding in the back corner anymore, but sitting at the piano in practice room 3, working with a middle-aged woman on a Chopin nocturne. "Beautiful tone," May was saying. "Try connecting these phrases more smoothly, like you're telling one continuous story." The woman tried again, her face relaxed in concentration. When she finished, she smiled with satisfaction. "That felt right." "It sounded right too," May confirmed. She looked up as Professor Reynolds knocked lightly on the open door. "We're just finishing." As the student gathered her music, Professor Reynolds handed May an envelope. "The board approved it. Starting summer session, you'll be officially on staff as an adjunct instructor." May took the envelope, her expression a mixture of surprise and pleasure. "Thank you. I never expected this when I walked into your class last fall." "Neither did I." Professor Reynolds chuckled. "But you've become our most requested teacher. Students who never showed interest in classical piano are signing up for your workshops." It had started informally, a few students asking for help after the recital, then more, until Professor Reynolds suggested May run a weekly workshop. The workshops became twice-weekly sessions, then individual lessons. Somewhere along the way, she had become a teacher in truth, not just in title. "Have you had a chance to think about the charity concert?" Professor Reynolds asked as they walked down the hallway together. May's steps slowed slightly. "I'm still not sure. It's a big step from teaching to performing publicly again. It's for a good cause," he reminded her. The Music Education Fund helps children who couldn't otherwise afford lessons. I know, May said softly. That's the only reason I'm considering it. She had been approached 3 weeks earlier about performing at a benefit concert to raise money for music education in underserved communities. The organizers had heard about her through Dr. Voronin, who remained in contact with the college music department. No pressure, Professor Reynolds assured her, but they need to finalize the program by next week. After he left, May walked to the recital hall. It was empty at this hour, peaceful in the afternoon light. She sat at the grand piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. The thought of performing in a concert hall again brought back flashes of anxiety, the crushing expectations, the fear of failure that had once consumed her. But those memories felt more distant now, less powerful than they had been. She began to play softly, a Beethoven sonata that had once been a staple of her competition repertoire. Her fingers remembered every note, every dynamic marking, but she played it differently now, not with the mechanical perfection of her youth, but with the maturity of someone who had lost music and found it again, who understood its value in a deeper way. That was lovely, said a voice from the doorway. May looked up to see Chen, now a familiar presence in her daily life. Their friendship had grown from secret keeper and musician to something deeper. Two people who understood what it meant to rebuild a life just remembering an old piece, she said. For the charity concert? He asked, sitting in one of the audience chairs. I haven't decided yet. May closed the piano lid gently. Part of me wants to say yes, to help children have access to music without the pressure I experienced. But another part still hesitates. Chen nodded thoughtfully. You know, I watched you these past months. When you teach, there's a light in your face that wasn't there when I first met you. You found a way to share your gift without being consumed by it. Teaching is different from performing, May pointed out. There's no judgment, no critics waiting to find flaws. True, Chen agreed. But I've also seen you change how you approach the piano when you play for yourself. You're not chasing perfection anymore. May considered his words. He was right. Somewhere along the way, her relationship with music had transformed. The piano was no longer an instrument of torture, but a trusted friend. Playing had become a conversation rather than a performance. That evening, May sat in her apartment, looking through an old photo album she had kept hidden in the back of her closet. Pictures of a solemn-faced child at grand pianos too big for her, standing beside stern teachers and beaming parents. Concert programs with her name in bold print. Newspaper clippings in various languages, all praising the extraordinary talent of the young prodigy. She closed the album and picked up her phone, dialing a number she rarely called. Mom? She said when a woman's voice answered in Chinese. It's me. The conversation was long overdue. She told her mother about teaching, about finding joy in music again, about the charity concert invitation. There were difficult moments, old wounds that hadn't fully healed. But beneath the pain was something that had been missing for years. Honesty. I'm proud of you, May, her mother said finally. Not because you're playing again, but because you found your own way back to it. Those words stayed with May as she entered Professor Reynolds' office the next morning. I'll do the charity concert, she said without preamble, but I want to play something new, not from my old repertoire. And I'd like some of my students to perform too. Professor Reynolds looked surprised but pleased. I'm sure that can be arranged. What piece did you have in mind? I'm going to compose something, May said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. A piece about losing your way and finding it again. The weeks leading up to the concert were filled with creative energy unlike anything May had experienced before. She worked on her composition during every free moment, sometimes calling students in to try parts of it, incorporating their feedback. She titled it Return, a piece that began with stark, isolated notes that gradually found harmony with one another, building to a middle section of complex, sometimes dissonant emotions, before resolving into a simple, peaceful conclusion. The night of the charity concert arrived on a perfect summer evening. The venue wasn't the grand concert hall of May's past performances, but the community center downtown, a warm, intimate space filled with people from the college and the wider community. Backstage, May wore a simple blue dress, elegant but comfortable. Her students buzzed around excitedly, peering through the curtains at the filling seats. Are you nervous? asked the young man from her original beginner class, now an intermediate student preparing to perform a Chopin waltz. Yes, May answered honestly. But it's a different kind of nervous than before. What kind? He asked curiously. May thought for a moment. It's like the difference between fearing a test you might fail and feeling butterflies before sharing something you care about with friends. The student performances came first, a showcase of progress that filled May with quiet pride. She watched from the wings, offering encouraging nods as each student took their bow. When it was finally her turn, May walked onto the stage with steady steps. The audience applauded warmly. Some knew her story, others only knew her as the talented teacher from the community college. She took a seat at the piano and adjusted the bench, taking a moment to center herself. Looking out at the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Professor Reynolds in the front row, Chen a few seats away, her students scattered throughout the crowd. But she also noticed dozens of children from the community music program that would benefit from the evening's proceeds. Young faces filled with curiosity and hope. May placed her hands on the E keys and began to play her composition. The music told her story more eloquently than words ever could. The rigid training of her childhood, the collapse under pressure, the long silence, and finally, the rediscovery of music on her own terms. As she played the final peaceful section, May realized she had found what she had been seeking since the day she slipped into the back row of that beginner class. Not a return to her former glory, but a reconciliation with her gift. The music flowed through her not as a demand for perfection, but as an expression of a life fully lived, with all its pain and beauty. The final note hung in the air, resonating through the hall before fading into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the audience rose to their feet, applause washing over May like a wave. As she stood to take a bow, she caught Chen's eye. He was smiling broadly, and she found herself smiling back without reservation. Later, as people mingled at the reception, a young girl approached May shyly. "I want to play like you someday," she said, her eyes wide with admiration. May knelt down to meet the child at eye level. "You'll play like yourself," she said gently. "That's even better." The girl's mother joined them, thanking May for her performance. "The music program means so much to us. We could never afford private lessons. Every child deserves the chance to discover music," May said, without the pressure to be perfect. As the evening wound down, May found herself standing outside the community center, looking up at the stars. Chen joined her, offering a cup of tea from the reception. "So," he said, "what comes next for Maylin?" She took a sip of tea, considering the question. "Not Maylin," she corrected gently. "Just May. And what comes next is Tuesday morning's beginner class, Thursday's composition workshop, and maybe—" She paused, a small smile playing at her lips. "Maybe more music of my own." The future stretched before her. Not a return to the past or an erasure of it, but a new path built on the foundation of everything she had experienced. She had stepped out of hiding and into a life where her gift served her, rather than the other way around. And for the first time in many years, that future looked not like a burden, but like a promise.